When we think of cultural treasures, and it's hard for us sometimes in the United States to have an appreciation for this because we're a new country. But if we think in this country of what could evoke outrage among us, it's the fact that the bad guys know people value and treasure these things. And the thing that they target first are the things that people believe in, their cultural treasures, their monuments, their literature, their works of art.
George was the eldest of 6 sons. When you notice what he was involved in at school, he was in band, orchestra, he was active in journalism, and he was the business manager of the school's high school annual, and contributed drawings to the high school annual, which are very quaint. So he graduated high school in 1915, went to Grinnell College, quite close to Winterset, within 100 miles. And spent 2 years there and then off to World War I. He saw the devastation of war and therefore knew what could happen to an art museum or a library or a university or a cathedral. But at any rate, he knew the devastation of war. He came back to Iowa and went to the University of Iowa and got his bachelor's degree in art there. And he evidently fell in love and was very passionate about art. And he then had applied for Harvard to get his master's degree. While he was there, he was busy at the Fogg Museum starting to develop scientific principles of art conservation and preservation.
We think of the Fogg as our birthplace of conservation in the U.S. But in 1928, the Fogg brought together under one roof scientists, art historians, and conservators. They had been in different buildings at the same time before that, but they began working together at the Fogg. So it became the sort of collaborative birthplace for our field in this country.
So George Stout came to the Harvard Art Museums because of Edward W. Forbes, who was the second director of what was at the time called the Fogg Museum. Stout was the one who found John Rutherford Gettins, who was a chemistry student here at Harvard, graduate student, and so came on board as a part-time chemist at the museum. And that was sort of the beginning of this amazing collaboration and of the scientific lab.
But George Stout also gave us the concept of the three-legged stool, which is the idea of conservation is the collaborative effort of science, art history, or anthropology, library science, depending on your specialty, and hand skills. And he explained that when he worked at the University of Iowa, there was a man who looked at plant leaves under a microscope. He was a botanist. And he was asked to do this behind closed doors because he was prying into the work of the Lord. And that is the feeling that people had about art conservation, that you shouldn't look at a painting with a microscope. That is somehow, as George Stout again in another interview said, it was naughty to inquire about the condition of a painting. You didn't x-ray it, you didn't go up close to it. It was as naughty as inquiring about the digestive system of an opera singer. And this is the era that he inherited in the 20s. He was a constant advocate for getting the field to move forward.
What we do here is look at works of art in close collaboration with curators and conservators. We want to understand questions about the works of art from a physical perspective. So we want to understand what is used by the artist to make up a work of art, what paints, what pigments, what layering is used. Some of the wood that had to be taken off the paintings was also saved, and so this is kept here as a reference as well. The pigments are used as a standard to identify the unknowns from a work of art. We've got dried sap from a rattan palm that's called dragon's blood. We've got ochres. We've got Indian yellow, which is the dried urine of cows fed only on mango leaves. Emerald green, which was a very poisonous pigment used in the 19th century. You find it in Van Gogh paintings a lot. All the pigments that we've just seen were used by Gettins and Stout to produce this book, Painting Materials, a short encyclopedia, which is the go-to book. It's the book that everyone still reaches for. This is a first edition, and it has a nice section on mediums, adhesives, and films, and then a nice big section on pigments. So we've got the 1966 edition, which is what everyone uses.
And that book was written in the 30s and 40s, and oddly enough is still a major resource, so that our doctoral students at the University of Delaware say there's very little correction needed in that book, which is really remarkable when you think about it, that it could be that good from that long ago, considering how scientific methods have evolved so extraordinarily.
Hitler tried to get into the art school in Vienna and was turned down. And he had, for years, done sort of, they're not bad. They're just sort of ordinary watercolors of buildings and things like that. But he was turned down, and it was one of the things that embittered him against the establishment in Austria, particularly, but also, I think, in Germany. If Hitler had gotten into the art school, things might have been very different in Europe and in the 1940s. But anyway, but he was always interested in art, and he was also interested in when he became leader of Germany. And when he went to Italy for the first time to visit Mussolini, he made Mussolini take him around to all the museums, and or Mussolini got tired of all these, seeing so many pictures, and he kept saying, tutti questi quadri, all these pictures. But Hitler was very inspired by that, and it was sort of after that that he decided that he wanted to build the biggest and best museum in Europe, which would have been in Linz, his hometown in Austria. But it was, I think, the usual dictator thing of, wanting to have his name on a big museum and make it the best in the world, which Napoleon had done. Napoleon really started the Louvre. And actually, Napoleon's lieutenants, or his brother, Joseph, was the one who really got the Prado going in Spain. So this is a kind of traditional thing that dictators do. Hitler had very distinct ideas about what was acceptable art and what was not. And so anything that was modern or unfinished, he called it, or abstract, or wasn't exactly sort of photographic type of art, he considered to be degenerate. He thought these things should be purged from the German collections, which indeed, starting in 1937, they were. And then anything that was politically anti-military, for instance, a lot of George Gross, Käthe Kollwitz, all of whom were, were not Jewish, they were German. Those were not acceptable because they did satirize the Prussian military authorities and organization. And then anything that was painted by anyone who was black or anything that was painted by a Jew, those were also to be purged. And they did, purge nearly 20,000 things from the German museums, many of which were destroyed, but also many of which were sold abroad because the Germans were smart enough to know that these things were worth a lot.
The greatest theft in history, it's hard to condense that to a soundbite, and we think of looting in the context of a theft, in the context of get in, get out, because the longer you're there, the greater the chance you're going to get caught. Speed is an essential element of theft. The Nazis had 6 years, where they were in control of country after country after country to fleece them of gold deposits in banks, paper currency, coins, paintings, tapestries, drawings, sculpture. If it had value, it was at risk of being stolen. In the East, the Nazis, because they disdained Slavs and Jews, considered that for the most part there wasn't a lot to loot there because they had no taste. The things that they had were at greater risk of being destroyed. There were notable exceptions, paintings by Leonardo or Raphael, but there was much more laid to waste in the eastern countries of Europe than in the West, where the Nazis intended on using it as a playground.
Well, Hitler wasn't the only one who collected art in the, in the upper ranks of the Nazis. It got to be a very kind of in thing. In fact, I think they all felt that they had to collect art because Hitler was doing that too. But Goering was a little different. He was one of the few people in the Nazi upper levels who was from a more distinguished family, and he really liked the art for itself, although his collection did run heavily to sort of ladies, naked ladies and things. It's been carefully analyzed by a lot of people, but sort of an arrangement was made whereby Hitler would get the first choice of things, that particularly from the Jewish collections and from the collections in occupied countries, and then Goering would get the next level down.
This was not looting as has always happened during war, that was incidental to war. This was something quite different than most wars, where there were German scholars visiting these countries years before the invasion, making a list of things that were going to be targeted, including things in private collections. So there was an enormous amount of resources dedicated to this looting operation.
The French had been able to evacuate most of their collections when the war started. First they took them to all the chateaux along the Loire, the wonderful chateaux, but then they thought the Maginot Line would hold and the Germans would never get into France. Well, it did not hold, and they did get into France, so then they had to move them again, and the Mona Lisa was among them. She had a special car because she's so famous. And she was never looted by the Germans, but they put her in this ambulance, and it was all sort of airtight and everything, which is the best they could do in those days. No air conditioning, I don't think. And when they got there, the Mona Lisa was fine, but the curator was unconscious because he hadn't had enough oxygen for a while. So, but she had a special box, was kept in the room with one of the curators at all times, and the Germans, of course, knew where these things were, but they did not feel they could, upset the French by taking all the collections. The Germans did not take too many things from the national collections of the countries they occupied because they were kind of waiting till they won the war. Because international law said that you could not take things away from the citizens of a country you occupied, they actually followed that rule so that they would wait until somebody had left And then they would declare the property abandoned. And then this included, of course, very cynically, the people who'd been sent to a death camp, that they had abandoned their property and therefore it was okay for the Germans to take it.
Stout had the vision to see that the technological developments to aerial bombing during the Spanish Civil War and the fires that were a consequence of these bombs, nothing on the scale of what would unfold during World War II, but he anticipated that this technology would continue to increase, and he had a great sense of how catastrophic it would be for cultural treasures and works of art. He started developing pamphlets about how to protect paintings and other art objects during war, long before World War II started. When the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked Pearl Harbor in the surprise attack on December 7, 1941, Stout was prepared. He was more prepared than anybody else in the United States. He was far more prepared than the country was, and was the catalyst in a meeting that took place at the Metropolitan Museum of Art several weeks later in 1941, shortly before Christmas. That was a gathering of the key cultural leaders in the United States, key museum directors, to discuss the steps that needed to be taken to protect American cultural treasures, with the great fear at the time being that the Japanese were going to invade the west coast of the United States and that the Nazis were capable of bombing the east coast of the United States. This, of course, in neither case unfolded. But as that fear passed, which we need to do no more than think back to some of the things that we were projecting or anticipating after September 11th, to imagine the milieu that they were in and the sense of fear that it created.
So I was born in 1927 in Boston. So there are always Japanese coming to visit, college students from MIT or Harvard or Tufts or Boston College. I mean, there are so many schools, and they all found their way to our house. There was no embassy. We're the unofficial embassy, the Japanese embassy in Boston. Well, I knew I didn't want to marry a Japanese man. No matter how westernized they were, they expected the man to be boss. And I was not going to kowtow to anybody. I was too independent. I was too American. I was alone in the apartment. It was a Sunday. I was reading a book curled up on the sofa as always. And then the telephone rang. And I went to answer it. And one of the Japanese college students said, "Are your folks at home?" I said, "No, they're not." Then he waited and waited. Finally said, blurted out, "Motoko, Japan and America are at war." I had no idea what to make of that. What can I do about it? And then we waited at the window for our parents to come back. And then pretty soon saw the car being parked. And then they were crossing the street and I shouted out the window, "Japan and America are at war." And I remember their faces absolutely turned white. They came rushing in. And for the rest of it, there was no television. We got everything on the radio. So we sat by the radio and listened, and over and over and over again, and we heard the announcer say, "The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor." And we had no idea what to do. Daddy kept saying, aren't they saying something else? Because after all, I was the one that spoke English the best in the family. No, that's all they're saying. So my mother and father must have stayed up all night trying to decide what to do the next day. Should the children go to school? And then we had a telegram from the government, U.S. government, saying, "If you desire repatriation, appear at Ellis Island by such and such a date." And again, I showed my mother and father stayed up all night trying to discuss it, but well, I said, "We're not wanted now. You might as well go back, and when the war is over, you can come back again." So it was decided. My mother, my brother, and I would go back to Japan on the repatriation ship, and Daddy would stay to look after his business and to look after the apartment until the war was over. But we were the enemy.
After Pearl Harbor, they were worried that there could be an invasion of the United States, and almost all the big museums evacuated their works of art. The National Gallery sent 75 major works to Asheville in the Carolinas, and The Metropolitan Museum actually was quite funny. They sent theirs to Philadelphia. I guess they thought that was remote enough. It wasn't New York, right? So that was, but they did, and it was sort of a country house. But they all were determined to stay open, the museums, and were part of the war effort.
Stout had the vision to see that the great achievements, great cultural achievements, the literary achievements, music, and so on of Western civilization all light in the path on the road to Berlin. And that if the United States did not take proper precautions to try and avoid damaging these things, the great risk was that we might end up winning the war, but in the process become the goats of history for destroying so much of Western civilization's culture. So it was his idea more than anyone else. In September '43, he was contacted by Paul Sachs at the Fogg Museum, his colleague, who wrote him to say that action had taken place on his recommendations. That President Roosevelt in June 1943 had completely endorsed this idea of cultural preservation officers. So he's on the upper end of the range of age of monuments men. Their average age was about 40. Stout was actually 46. But it was Stout's thinking, the years of planning, both as to the big picture of needing to do something, creating these cultural preservation officers that we call monuments men, as well as the technical details of how to go about protecting cultural treasures. If there's a father that gave birth to this concept of modern-day monuments men, it was George Stout.
There were never very many at one time, and they worked like dogs. I mean, I think George Stout says in somewhere that he had worked 18 hours a day for, it wasn't actually a very long time. It was something like a year and a half, but he must have never stopped day or night.
Balfour was one of the original monuments men. He was a professor of art. He was British. The monuments operation was a joint combination of American and British officers at the beginning, and it was his responsibility to, largely self-designated, to try and find out what had happened to Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna from Bruges, Belgium. The Allied armies were about a week down the road from Bruges, Belgium, and the Nazis, rather than running the other way, had orders to go get this sculpture by Michelangelo. And so in the face of doing the opposite of what human nature would be, they're actually moving towards the oncoming advance of the Western Allies because they still have one more thing to steal. It really underscores how determined they were to execute this looting plan. Balfour was enormously disappointed to be arriving days after it was gone, and made it his mission to try and find this hugely important work by Michelangelo, the only sculpture by Michelangelo to leave Italy during his lifetime. And Balfour was in the German town of Cleve, removing some church treasures from a church there. In evacuating the church treasures, he and three fellows had a cart that they had loaded these things onto, and they were pushing it down a street outside the church. The three guys with the cart on one side of the street, Balfour on the other side of the street, so they couldn't have been more than 15 to 20 feet apart. And there was an explosion, artillery, I think, and the three guys on one side of the street were fine, and Balfour was killed. There was another monuments officer, an American monuments officer named Walter Hutchhausen from Perry, Oklahoma, who was an architect, a very accomplished architect, 39 years old. Hutchhausen was checking out a report of looted art with another monuments officer, Sheldon Keck, and they got disoriented and found themselves behind enemy lines, and German machine gunners. Firefight erupted, and Hutchhausen was killed.
My father came to America as a college student. He'd just finished college in Japan, a dental college in Japan, and he wanted to learn how to treat buck teeth. He wanted to become an orthodontist because in those days, the typical stereotype of a Japanese is black hair, nearsighted glasses, and buck teeth. Dad was going to become an orthodontist and fix all the buck teeth in Japan. That was the beginning. The day after we left, the FBI walked into his office, took him, and put him in the East Immigration Jail. And then he was sent to Montana, where all the Japanese were collected. And he was out there in the desert, surrounded by barbed wire, with armed guards aiming their guns at him, until my mother found out through the International Red Cross that that was where he was. And then she pulled some strings, and she managed to get him on the second exchange ship to come back to Japan and join us. But when he came back, he was a broken man. He was only in his 50s. So he was like an old man. I mean, we treated like a criminal in the jail and then taken out with barbed wire fence around you. I mean, it just was too much for him to understand. So he was just a completely broken man. And everybody thought he was so brave because he never went out when the bombs were falling, but he didn't care whether he lived or died. So I always say that he was as much a victim of the war as any soldier shot in battle. I mean, when the bombs are falling, you don't study. It's all you can do to survive. And I remember we were hungry. It was dangerous to walk in the streets. I remember fainting at the front door when I walked in because I was so hungry. Those are tough times.
As the war progressed and Nazi Germany found itself on the defensive, they were concerned about protecting their own works of art. Again, the whole thing's running now in reverse. So they have to evacuate their works of art from their museums and find places to hide those. They have to remove works of art that are destined for Hitler's museum, the Führer Museum, and find a safe place for those. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different places that this handful of men were responsible for checking out every single one of them to try and identify what's there, secure them so that they would not be looted by Allied soldiers or displaced persons, or destroyed deliberately by Nazi fanatics, if that's not an oxymoron. Europe is possessed with a lot of salt mines, and these, in some cases, proved acceptable hiding places for the works of art.
It was just a miracle that more of them weren't killed because the Germans had hidden these collections and various other treasures in all kinds of mines and caves, and they were usually booby-trapped, so that it was very dangerous going in there. They had strung wires and things would blow up, and you know, so they never knew what was going to happen.
It was an extraordinarily difficult challenge, and one that they were really winging it as they went, trying to figure out what do you do when you walk into a salt mine and you see 7,000 paintings, of which many of them are some of the most important works of art by those artists in the world.
One of the things they took that belonged to Belgium was the Ghent altarpiece. And the reason was that a piece of it was in Germany and some of it had been stolen from Germany way back. And the Belgians had put it in the south of France, in a town called Pau in the south of France. And so the Germans sent an expedition down there to get it and take it back to Germany, which was, lots of delays by the French, but they couldn't prevent it. And in the end, to protect it, it was put in Alt-Aussee, this mine near Salzburg, the salt mine. And another wonderful thing that he retrieved was the Michelangelo Madonna and Child that is also from Belgium. But they did take that to Alt-Aussee too. That was recovered. There's a picture of George Stout packing that one in an old mattress and sort of a lace bedspread. It's really just remarkable. He was so ingenious at protecting things and using whatever was available to rescue things.
And time again, the responsibility for answering that question fell in the lap of George Stout. He was the one that, it wasn't that the other monuments officers didn't have an idea what to do, they did, and certainly they did after having worked with him, but they all trusted Stout, and he was a calming influence. He was, as one monuments officer described him, you wanted to believe what George Stout had to say. I think it instilled confidence in everyone because of his quiet, self-effacing demeanor and a sense of confidence and tremendous proficiency in doing his job. Fortunately, in March 1945, as the Western Allied forces were well into Germany, advancing on Berlin, the outcome of the war is not in doubt anymore. What's in doubt is how much longer it's going to take to end it in Europe. There's enormous frustration on the part of the Western Allies about the continued resistance by Nazi Germany.
Well, the Nazis at the end of the war, at least some of them, had a scorched earth policy, particularly when it came to industry and whatnot, but some of them also had this feeling about works of art. But luckily, there were cooler heads everywhere.
We think about the drama of them finding stolen objects, but the primary function was preventative medicine, to try and protect cultural treasures from destruction. The detective work of them becoming art looting investigators, it was really responding to the circumstances they found once they got there. That wasn't something that was anticipated anywhere on the scale of what they ended up doing.
These officers were very low ranking, so that they couldn't commandeer transport or things like that, and this made particularly moving large quantities of fragile works of art very difficult. And the French curators, it was very interesting. They had their things in repositories all over France, mostly in the south of France, but a few in the north, in Lille and places like that. And they were not sure what the Americans were going to do, whether we were just going to, take everything too. And so they were very cagey about telling us where things were. There's a very famous woman called Rose Valland who worked at the Louvre all during the war, and nobody knew that she spoke German. She got negatives of all the pictures the Germans were taking of the things they were stealing from the private collections. And she kept lists of where they were going. But it took her a long time to be convinced to tell the monuments men where they were and to share this information. But in the end, she did. And then she too went to Germany in her uniform by then, and was a monuments woman. and helped, identify the works of art that had been taken from France.
On the 9th of August, Nagasaki had been bombed. One bomb, an entire city had been destroyed. And we were sure the third bomb was for us in Tokyo, because we were the capital. We were where the emperor lived. And we thought, there's nothing we can do. So the next time the siren blew, we headed to the nearest bomb shelter we could find and waited to die and hoped we would die instantly. That's what we prayed for. Let it be swift. Let it be final, let it be fast. And the emperor surrendered. He surrendered unconditionally. And the relief, we don't have to worry about dying in an atomic bomb fire at all again. We were still hungry, but we weren't afraid anymore.
At the end of the war, the Army wanted out of the restitution business, understandably so. That's not what armies do. And in a break with centuries of history, the conquering armies of the West said to the victors, do not belong the spoils of war. These things should be given back to the people to whom they belong. So the policy of the Western Allies was to return these things to the countries from which they'd been taken, trusting that each respective country would be diligent about trying to identify who these objects that they were receiving belonged to, and that they would be diligent in trying to get them back.
But Stout was just extraordinary, and he just, they packed things and all kinds of stuff and got it back to Munich, which is where they started something called the collecting point, which is, they brought works of art together. Representatives came later from each country to try to identify the works of art and send them back to where they belonged.
And what the scampering for art at the end of World War II was all about was the United States laying down as a philosophical notion respect for other cultures, and that art should be returned to the countries from which it was made and owned. The Russians taking the position that art was a booty of war, that is, that anything they found was theirs. And we put a different card on the table in terms of judgment, in terms of American values that were widely respected and appreciated by the rest of the world. And George Stout is the symbol of that card, of that aspect of American culture that no one was thinking about in wartime. But at the same time, we understood at the end of the war, we would have a confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that's exactly what occurred, and that's where George Stout played such a seminal role.
And then Stout came back here, and after a couple of months, he was sent off to do the same thing in Japan, which is, where he also did a remarkable job.
I was the kid in the office. That's what he always called me, the kid in the office. And for George Stout, I would type up these little cards, a card for each temple or shrine or garden, tell the location, what the situation was like, and put it back in this huge filing cabinet in alphabetical order, and that was my job. It was peacetime. I was climbing up 6 flights of stairs to get to the office, and I was writing about these particular famous Japanese places, gardens, temples, shrines, you name it, to make sure that they weren't looted, to be sure they were protected. Because the looting could be not only from the Americans, the GIs, the Allies forces, but also from the Japanese themselves. They were poor, so they were at the point they'd steal anything in order to turn it into money and food. But the hardest decision I ever had to make in my life was to decide which to be. Because after the war between Japan and America, I could not have dual citizenship anymore. I could not be Japanese and American at the same time. I was American because I was born in America. I was Japanese because they registered me in the family registry in Japan. I was both. I couldn't decide which to be. But American, I'm sure I could get a job. I'm sure I could fend for myself no matter where I was. I'm sure I could go to college. So I did. But that was the hardest decision I ever had to make.
I mean, I think that there was so much discombobulation and sort of people trying to sort of piece things together after the war that it just didn't quite gel as it might have, and I think he sort of got frustrated with the situation. He wasn't necessarily the easiest person to get along with, so, and there were a number of people like that, ambitious, and he ended up being offered a job at Worcester as a director. So, and then from there he eventually also came back to the Boston area and became the director of the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, where he also did conservation work. But what did happen after the war, and that's very important, and he was very much involved in all that, was what eventually sort of was the, you know, a meeting that laid the foundation for what became the International Institute for Conservation.
George Stout, before he came here, he'd already been working at the Fog Art Museum for a number of years, and he came here and established the department and asked, you know, the director what he needed in terms of equipment and staffing. And again, it was this real understanding that there were a lot of people doing work who probably shouldn't be, and how can we do really good work on our collection, but also instill the notion of training a new generation of people to come and work with you, so you can train them on how to do these things. And actually that's something that we still do here today, which is we bring in pre-program candidates that are trying to get into conservation. We train them, we spend a year or two with them. They go off to graduate school, do their masters. And we also have people coming in after they've done that to do you know, more specific research projects or treatments on the collection. So it's one also not just of thinking it in terms of the continuum of what Stout was doing, but also with the coming generation of conservators who we want to make sure have the best opportunities to learn on really great collections.
I look upon the laser as an atomic bomb for light. As the common explanation of the atomic bomb is, it's a chain reaction.
An art conservator in Venice said, why don't you try cleaning some of these statues? Cleaning is the most difficult operation we have in saving these statues, and we need a better technique. And we were all amazed that it worked.
And what I do with lasers in art is really laser dermatology applied to artworks. I realized that some of the problems with artworks are very similar to the problems with human tissue, and that lasers ought to work on removing corrosive materials and damaging materials from artworks just as well as they can remove tattoos and birthmarks from human tissues, and published a paper on it. And that's about the time I heard from George Stout, which was in the summer of 1972. And George had heard about our work, so he invited me to give a lecture at the Nelson Art Gallery in Kansas City for that opening session of the AIC. Several of these important people who ran conservation laboratories around Canada and the United States started attacking me. I was really puzzled that here I, a stranger, was being attacked for doing something ridiculous. So I think at one of the coffee breaks, George was at my shoulder at the time, and he said, yeah, don't take it so seriously. He said, those old codgers who are running the art conservation field, they're going to die off. And then those young people over there are going to take over. And then it'll be time for your laser to make its appearance in art conservation.
As I understand it, there was this damage in all the photographs that were shown everywhere, a 19th century Christ that was flaking very badly. And some member of the parish decided she would come in, and not knowing any of the principles of stay within the lines of the losses, she repainted the face looking a lot like a monkey. And this got international publicity, and people still talk about it. I mean, it got more publicity for not doing it yourself. I hope that's what came to many people's minds after seeing it than anything else I can think of. So that happened.
American Institute for Conservation is a national professional organization that includes individual and institutional members who are committed to the conservation and preservation of cultural heritage. These conservators are responsible for the examination, documentation, analysis, treatment, and preventive care of cultural heritage of all kinds.
And it's the biggest honor as a restorer, as a Belgian restorer, to work on our most important heritage. Can we find certain damages that happened in the mines, maybe? Do we find those on the panels? So we're going into it a little bit archaeologically, like we understand the layer before we remove it. So we also have an eye for what happened in the salt mines, because they might or might not have gotten treatment by the Nazis themselves. They very likely had restorers.
Right about the time I became chairman of the House Banking Committee, to read a small article in a newspaper that indicated that Swiss banks had not completely revealed their role and had therefore not compensated people that deserved compensation. And what you had in the Nuremberg trials was accountability for a very, very small number of people. And in a way, that's what you have here, accountability of a small number of people for a small number of people. But it's important to have the precept of accountability.
It's the obligation of all of us in the spirit of Hanukkah to rededicate ourselves to the establishment of justice. This hearing is adjourned.
But there is something in all cultures that is a little bit vulnerable to fascism. And we should always be careful.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
Iraq is known as the cradle of civilization, and it's some of the most important ancient civilizations, some of the first cities, the first writing. Iraq is really the land of the first cities, and I remember being told that by archaeologists just as I knew I was going to get deployed there to try to help the museum. And that understanding of the depth of the history there was really daunting to me, and realizing how much they'd lost already before I could even get there to help. When I arrived at the Iraq Museum in May 2003, the looting had already happened more than a month prior. And when I arrived, I really met a lot of traumatized colleagues. They had lost some of their most important collections. The looters, what they couldn't take, often in the galleries, they smashed. We tried to help them in those immediate days get better security, stabilize things, and gradually started to help them rebuild the museum so that they could again safely house their collections. We worked to get some of the inventory books, photos of the collections, and immediately started to look in the community. We put up wanted posters with pictures of the missing objects and put out a no questions asked policy that people could bring things back to the collection, to the museum, no questions asked. One of the most exciting recoveries that we made after the looting of the Iraq Museum was the head of Worka. It's the earliest known representation of a female face from antiquity, often thought to be the goddess Inanna or Ishtar, and it was gone missing from the looting of the Iraq Museum and had been on all of the wanted posters that were out there. And there was a tip-off that this might be buried in the backyard of someone. And eventually the military police recovered it on one of these tips, and we got a phone call in our office in the Green Zone saying, "We think we have the head of Worka, ma'am." And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's such good news. What are you doing with it? Is it safe?" And you know, this is the iconic piece from the Iraq Museum, the Mona Lisa of Mesopotamia. And they said, "Well, so it's important. Well, I'll tell the boys to stop tossing it around out back." And I paused and he said, "Ma'am, I'm just kidding, lighten up." And they brought it to the museum the very next day. The military police had been working with the Iraqi police as a team, and they were able to recover this really important piece for the collection. And it was a really exciting day when we had the big press conference to announce that the head of Worka was recovered. While I was in Iraq, I understood much more clearly that the United States had never ratified the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. And I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. And so right away I started trying to think of things, even while I was still in Iraq, of how the cultural heritage community of professionals could work toward convincing the Senate to ratify this treaty that the U.S. had really drafted based on the success of the World War II Monuments Men. And so when I got home, we gathered together a group of professionals, archaeologists, museum professionals, libraries, archives, to come together to create a U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, which is the U.S. version of an international group, the Blue Shield, which is dedicated to supporting the 1954 Hague Convention. It's like the Red Cross is to the Geneva Convention, the Blue Shield is to the Hague Convention.
One of the major activities of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield is to prepare what we call no strike lists or no target lists. These are lists of cultural sites, archaeological sites, but also historic structures and repositories such as museums, libraries, and archives. And we give those lists to the Department of Defense, to the Defense Intelligence Agency. So this is a major activity of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield and is a core element in assisting the United States government in fulfilling its international legal obligations.
Every war, every conflict that we've had since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution has become progressively more and more destructive. And the power of that destruction today goes beyond anything that any of us can personally imagine. And if we don't have some kind of parameters and expectations and systems in place to control the conduct, we are at immense loss for losing our history, our cultures, and our societies.
I think the destruction of Palmyra probably ranks right up there at the top. And it's just a stunning archaeological site, and one from which we learn a lot. And the fact that that has been destroyed so much really, I think, has affected everyone. I get notices every day of the destruction of cultural property all around the world, and we used to put those on the Blue Shield website when all of this first started. And after a while, we decided that we wouldn't do that anymore because that's what ISIS wanted. They wanted that recognition. So we put a statement on our website that says we will no longer document these destructions.
We owe a great debt to Stout and all those monuments men who put their lives on the line. And we at the Blue Shield, we live in their shadow today.
So I get asked a lot why we should care about cultural heritage when there's a catastrophic disaster, when there's a war, when people are dying. And it seems to me that it's usually an American who's asking me that. The colleagues on the ground that are in the midst of this catastrophe know why they're asking us to help them. And there are many, many organizations that provide humanitarian support in a disaster, but there are very few of cultural heritage organizations that offer this kind of support. And never once was I asked by someone in Haiti, well, why are you here helping with cultural heritage when so many people have died? Because they knew that we were the Smithsonian, we were there to help with the cultural heritage.
You know, I think we learned from the conflict in Iraq that a failure to honor other people's cultural heritage and their cultural property, and a failure to follow the principles of the Hague Convention cost America. I think that in retrospect, a couple of the biggest military defeats of America in that war was, number one, the looting of the Iraqi National Museum, and number two, the photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison. In one case, it was the Geneva Convention at the prison, and the other, it was the Hague Convention at the Iraqi National Museum. And if we can keep the military from making those kind of strategic mistakes, that helps America to win wars. So not only does it protect cultural heritage, not only does it maintain civilization, but it helps us win within the framework of what America in particular stands for.
To me, mankind, a vast family of creatures, is growing inevitably towards a state of civilization. I believe that in time long past, there started among us an appetite for understanding and fairness, and we began to make things that would contain some of the meanings we found and hold them in words or paint or stone. I have to admit that man's growth towards civilization looks slow and unsteady. At moments, whole nations seem to fall back. Their people fret for deliverance from selfish fears. They pay homage to persons who've snatched power for themselves, all manner of tyrants. And people beg them for comfort and for peace. But when I look beyond the weak spots, I can notice those men who pursue knowledge for the common benefit, or labor for sound structures rather than for gain, or fight and die, not for praise or possessions, but for the freedom of others. That, I believe, is it, to build something. Although they might wander off, men come back to works like these, and back to the way of civilization. I believe they always will. At such tasks, they are free from strife. They are calm in the awareness that although the parcel of a man's life is small, the grandeur of men's growth is infinite. This, I believe.
Fight for the right, they are for the